Linguini twins were ordinary kids like many others. They enjoyed going outside and playing with the other kids in the neighborhood. They loved more than anything just to go explore the area they lived in. It was a nice and quiet place away from the busy traffic of the main road, really just allowing them the full range of the neighborhood they played in. Next to their beautiful single-story home, they had a go-kart track and sand pits they would go to play in. They really loved going deep in the sand pits and playing or just trying to get out of them. Nothing was off limits for them. One day, the twins woke up as usual playing the PS3 for a little bit before wanting to go outside and play. They had asked if they could have their cousin come over and hang out with them and play outside, and so he got dropped off that day. The three of them were bored with their usual shenanigans, and so they always seen these tall pine trees that were close to them. They were located across the canal next to them, and it was about a block or two away from their house. This day, they decided they would go explore the inside of this thick forested area. What they didn't know is what they were going to find. Hanging out and laughing like usual, the three made jokes and walked up the dry canal bed, and then through some thick brush to get to the front of these massive pine trees. They started entering the tall canopy, pushing past the fresh pine branches and making their way inside. Once they got into the middle of the canopy, it opened up, revealing a tiny little shack covered in pine needles, and what seemed to be a canoe. The boys walked slowly up to the boat, first noticing immediately that there were SIM cards scattered all over the area. They started collecting these SIM cards and were wondering exactly why these would be out here. After all, they did have all abandoned houses around them. The boy's cousin put them in his pocket without thinking much of it. Then they carried on, moving over to the little shack that seemed run down and covered in pine needles. The boys noticed the door was open just slightly, and being the curious ones they were, they opened the shack. They were immediately caught off guard by shelves of weird medicine, needles, and there was even dead turtles everywhere in the area. They didn't quite know what they were stumbling upon at the time, so they got really freaked out and left. They shut the shack and went to go play somewhere they felt more comfortable. Later that day, the boys were whistled in by their father. The boys had all forgotten all about the experience at this point, but the cousin hadn't. He took out all of the cards they had found and immediately started trying to figure out how they were going to view what was on them. The cousin had the idea of putting the cards into his Wii, and hopefully through this they could view whatever was on him. And so the cousin ran to go get his Wii he had brought with him to check out the cards. They sat there silently as the Wii loaded, and as the cousin slid in the first SIM card, what they were met by wasn't the most scary thing. Maybe it wasn't even the most scary thing at all. But one thing was for sure, it was definitely unsettling. It was pictures of a family posing in the woods, seeming to be really happy and taking some sort of family portrait. The rest were just extra photos from the same day, but something was off about these photos. The boys couldn't quite figure out what it was. They ended the night taking turns playing video games on their PS3 and eventually ended up falling asleep. The next day, the boys' uncle came to get their cousin from the house, and the boys wanted to go outside like usual. So they headed out. The boys didn't want to go back into those creepy woods from yesterday, so they chose to go play in the go-kart track and sand pits. Everything was going as usual until they started playing in the sand pit. The pit in particular wasn't the deepest hole, but it still made for a fun challenge to play around in. The boys started running around and playing, trying to see who could get out in the fastest time. They did this a couple times, but on the third race, something weird started happening around them. They noticed the pit seemed like it was getting deeper and deeper. No matter what they did or how hard they tried, they could not get out of this pit, and it continued to grow. Suddenly, beneath the boys' feet, the sand gave way, causing them to start sinking at an alarming rate. Before anyone knew it, the boys disappeared into the hole without a trace. The boys suddenly awoke, both laying face down in the sand. They looked around and made out what seemed to be the same hole they fell victim to. What they didn't know, this wasn't the same hole. This wasn't even the same dimension. The boys stood up, wiping sand from their faces. When they got to the top of the pit, they both stopped and stared at a vast, empty wasteland. Their house and neighbors' houses were dilapidated and falling apart. All trees seemed to have died except for the pine tree forest. The same forest the boys were terrified of. They looked over at each other in looks of terror. The home they loved was basically non-existent, and so was the neighboring homes. The boys let out a deep and painful cry while embracing, but they both knew that just sitting around wouldn't get them home. Having only one place to go and feeling like this all had to be connected somehow, the boys collected themselves and started off on a journey towards this pine forest. As they left the go-kart track and started walking past the crumbles of foundation that used to be their house, the boys noticed something laying on the ground. It was a piece of paper, somehow seeming to be the only thing surviving the wasteland. They unfolded the piece of paper and read,
Rule number 1, never stray from the path, for the darkness beyond holds unknown horrors. Rule number 2, trust no one. The faces you see may hide sinister intentions, even if it's someone you know. Rule number 3, keep moving forward. If you stand still, it invites the grasp of terrifying forces. Rule 4, do not speak of what you see. Certain words have power in these cursed lands. Rule number 5, beware the whispers in the shadows, for they may lead you astray. This includes the voices of loved ones.
The boys looked at each other puzzled. They had no clue what this list of rules was. Curious as always, they studied the rules, making sure they thought they knew most of them, before shoving the paper back into one of their pockets. They could only make out what seemed to be a small path. They assumed this would be the one they needed to follow, so they started moving. As they followed a winding path, the silence was the scariest thing to the boys. The minutes seemed to stretch longer and longer. The more they walked, the farther and farther the pine forest seemed to get. They didn't understand. Despite the growing sense of unease, they stayed on their trail, their steps quickening with each passing minute. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the darkness descended upon the wasteland, they realized they had lost their way. One of the boys fumbled into his pocket.
Rule 1, never stray from the path, for the darkness beyond holds unknown horrors.
They both freaked out and immediately started backtracking. They started running back from the way they had just came. As they ventured deeper back from that way, the air grew thick with a dark fog, and once the familiar sounds of the silent forest turned into low and guttural sounds, the boys felt their pounding lungs each step, but they pressed on, fueled by their youthful energy. Suddenly, the darkness seemed to close in around them, taking up what little light of the moon they had. Shapes twisted in the blackness, whispering weird and low chants. The sent shivers down their spines. Goosebumps erupted across the boys' arms, and when they suddenly heard their dad's signature whistle from the woods, this whistle always meant it was time to come inside. Desperate to escape, they stumbled through the undergrowth, each step leading them closer to the whistle. But that's when the boys stopped and fumbled with the paper again.
Rule number 5, beware the noises in the shadows, for they may lead you astray. This includes the voices of loved ones.
They both fell immediately to their knees, knowing this couldn't be their father. Then, emerging from the shadows, they saw a terrible entity, neither human nor beast, its form shifting and contorting with every passing moment. The eyes had no life, and they were fixated on the intruders. Suddenly, the voice of their mother said,
Come on over here, boys. It'll all be okay.
They almost flew out of their shoes, running in the opposite direction. The boys continued running for a while until they stumbled back onto the path out of sheer luck. They took this moment to catch a breath and go over what they had just seen. They had confronted each other, talking about how it's all just a crazy dream and what they had seen could not be real. What they didn't know at the time is that they had made a crucial mistake. They had broken 2 rules. Rule 4, do not speak of what you see. Certain words have power in these cursed lands. And also, Rule 3, keep moving forward. If you stand still, it invites the grasp of terrifying forces. As they stood there catching their breaths, the boys trembled with fear, when suddenly from peeking behind a tree, their cousin shouted.
Hey, are you guys okay?
As he started walking out from behind the tree, he said,
I'm scared, guys. Is that really you?
The eldest Linguini twin pulled the paper from his pocket. Rule 2. Trust no one. The faces you see may hide sinister intentions, even if it's someone you know.
Back up!
The boy shouted to his cousin. Their cousin at this point had stopped walking, and they stared at each other. The cousin then said,
You have to trust me. I'm scared and I want to go home too.
The youngest boy then asked his cousin, Well, then how did you find us? And at that exact moment, the cousin pulled the same piece of paper the boys had out of his pocket. He said that he hadn't been looking for them at all. He had been following his own path to this point. At this point, the boys started to lighten up, gesturing for their cousin to come join them. Now, with all three of them together, they made sure to start moving and following the path as close as they could. Not long after meeting up, they had finally made it to the towering pine forest. No one wanted to enter, but they knew if they'd stayed too long, it could end badly. They decided to make their way into the forest. Upon entering the forest, they were immediately greeted by the same familiar canoe and tiny shack. What was new, on the other hand, was a 2-story abandoned house on stilts. They felt a cool air as they entered the forest, still following the trail closer to the house. Making their way up to the front of the house, they immediately noticed even more dead turtles and needles than before. Driven by their desire to get home, they continued underneath the house, checking out all the abandoned gear. Slowly making their way to the steps that led to the 2nd story, the boys walked carefully and quietly. They were greeted by the front door of the house not even being on the hinges. They made their way slowly inside, taking note of family photos all over the walls and all around the house. It was the same family from the SIM card photos they had uncovered. Deeply disturbed and terrified, the boys continued into the back room of the house, where there seemed to be some kind of ritualistic shrine. They studied the objects that made up this piece, and it included some disturbing things. They had eyeballs, dead turtles, limbs of dead animals, and more. Thinking that all of this had something to do with what was happening to them, the youngest Linguini freaked out and destroyed everything in sight, smashing family portraits and destroying the shrine itself. The eldest Linguini twin then suddenly fell to the floor, and when the others tried to go help, they noticed they started feeling super dizzy, and they both collapsed on the floor as well. They all three suddenly awoke back in the sand pit, to their concerned dad shaking them violently, asking what was wrong. The boys didn't really know how to explain all of this to their dad, and they didn't think he would believe them anyways, so they chose not to tell. They just explained how they felt sick and just wanted to go out to eat or something maybe. The boys' dad didn't question them much, but suddenly as they were all talking in the pit about where to go to eat, they suddenly heard their dad's whistle from the house not too far away. The boys froze.